Welcome to the Broadway Podcast, the theater history podcast where a couple of doctors sit around and talk about Broadway. I'm your co-host, Dr. Kristin Stultz Pressley, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, Dr. Tracey Brent-Chessum. Tracey, tell us what we're talking about today.
So we're doing our timeline episodes for the next couple of episodes this week. I'm really excited about this because I feel like we've talked about Oklahoma and people have gotten a sense of what those particular episodes are going to look like. These episodes, are really designed to give us the overview. So we're going to go from kind of the beginnings of American musical theater to Oklahoma in this particular episode. And then in the next episode, we'll go from Oklahoma to the present. I think what's interesting here, well, maybe it's not so interesting, maybe it's just something that we need to make sure everybody understands, is the fact that this is going to be a whirlwind. This is not every little detail. We'll do eras episodes and really kind of dive into what that era looked like. This is really a timeline. And so it starts kind of at the beginning and just kind of gives you timeline aspects. This happened here, this is this new genre, here's where these things are coming. So keep that in mind that you're not going to get the full picture here, but you're going to get an overview of when things happened and when things happen in relationship to kind of American history events as well. So I think that's really important.
And I think it's also important to say, and I'm sure we've alluded to it before, I just don't recall specifically saying it, but it is important to say that most of the time when we look at something as the first whatever, generally there have been a number of things that have led to that thing happening. So it is so difficult to say, oh, well, this is the first time this ever happened, because then the deeper you dig into history, the more you're like, I think they were doing that there too, right? Yeah. So it is a slow roll. These progressions are very often slow rolls that maybe this show starts it and this show takes it a little bit up a notch and on and on and on and on and on until we get Oklahoma that was doing amazing things, but really it was picking up on amazing things that other shows had been working on.
Exactly. So that's what we're kind of looking at, going with that idea of the first. I agree. It's really hard as a historian to say that this is the first anything, because you're going to get egg on your face. Always. And we'll talk about a specific first that I have a huge problem with that everybody laughs about.
I know where you're going with that.
I think we know where we're going. So first, the other thing that I want everybody to know who's listening is that we are going to put a copy of this timeline on the website so that there is kind of a visual schematic for you to look at as well. So that'll be available if you go to the Dr. Broadway website. So let's get started and kind of go back. Remember, we're looking at American musical theater. One of the things that we have to realize is that everything in America is predicated on European types, because the people who come to America and set up, the United States of America as we know it, they are all coming from Europe. So we have to kind of give homage to the fact that there has been a musical theater genre in Europe since the 1400s. When we start with opera back in the Renaissance. So we have that kind of thing, and that grows and changes, obviously. If you look at the development of musical or music theater, as they would probably call it in England, they have their own specific styles, but a lot of those styles are being imported, and they're not being necessarily created from the ground up in the United States when the United States gets its start. Part of the reason is economic. If you think about how, like, you need that rising middle class, you need that burgeoning middle class to have disposable income to go see shows. So it has to kind of fit where the United States is at the time. So if we look at, if we're just talking about a timeline of American musical theater, where I tend to start is with usually the ballad opera. If you look at theater in the colonies, you have several theater troupes that are coming in from England they are importing these kinds of community entertainments from England to raise everybody's spirits as they're building a new nation. We get our first, again, there's that word, what we think is the first kind of theater companies in the 1780s. And yes, they are doing a lot of straight plays, but there's a lot of musicals in there too. There's a lot of musical interludes. So one of the things that we know is happening is a form called ballad opera. And the most famous ballad opera that came from England is the Beggar's Opera by John Gay, which is 1729, I believe. A ballad opera basically is a show that's written through and has kind of music in it that helps push the plot forward. But that music is usually based on bar tunes, which is my favorite thing in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a key thing with Beggar's Opera is that it was folk songs and street music that people heard, which set it apart from an opera, a classical opera, or even an intermezzi, which would have been using that same style of music that was used in an opera.
Exactly.
So that's a really key component, is that the music was hummable and singable and familiar to the people who would be seeing these shows.
Yeah, and it's also one of those things where we look and say, hey, those actors that are performing in it, the people that are putting it on, they know this form intrinsically. Like, they know it very well. So they can, what we call, interpolate that the music of the colonies, music that's, actually being created from the American colonies, that maybe isn't from England, is actually homegrown, and incorporating it into their shows as well. So we do see a lot of evidence that is happening as early as the 1780s.
And Tracey, I don't want to slow your roll here, but I do want to point out just how this is still being done today.
Oh,
If you look at Moulin Rouge, the musical, what is it attempting to do?
Yeah.
It's wanting to take popular music and tell a story with it. What was John Gay doing with the Beggar's Opera in 1729? Popular music to tell a story. That's why I say, if you have aspirations of being a historian, be really, really humble and willing to admit, wait a minute, I really had staked a flag here that this was the first or the best or the wah, 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 wah. Because I guarantee you're going to find out that it's not as groundbreaking as you might have thought.
Yeah, it's kind of fun. The next major rung on our timeline, where we start seeing something new happening, and is definitely American in its creation, is in the 1840s. And this is the minstrel show. This is, again, that first word. It's not really a first, but it is one of the major musical theater forms that is the most historical. So it's the furthest back, that is creating something that we don't see in our European predecessors. So this is something that is brand new from a historical vantage point. It starts with the Virginia Minstrels in 1843 with Daniel Decatur Emmett. And he looks at this and he says, okay, I want to create a family entertainment, much like these ballad operas, using the same kind of musical precedents that are out there, but there's not a lot of plot to it. Usually what would happen is they would sit in a semicircle and you've got Mr. Interlocutor and Mr. Bones and Mr. Tambo, and they kind of run the show, but it's little short snippets. It's not a narrative all the way through. One of the things that that the minstrel show creates for American society is this litany of Black stereotypes that are racist in depiction and are still a part of our American media today. There's still a lot of this around. It's not something that's gone away. It's you start realizing just how influential these moments are. This is the form that creates the Sambo character, the Mammy character, the old darky, the tragic mulatto, the Zip Coon. and creates then from there a litany of songs for these individual characters that follow them for years to come. It was meant during the 1840s, if you think about what's happening in the country at that time, it's meant to provide a sentimental, nostalgic view of slave life. That's what they're trying to do with these. That's their stated goal, is that they're looking for everybody should see the happy slave, which think about what's happening in our country. There's a huge debate, and we're about to go to civil war over slavery. And so Daniel Decatur and his Virginia minstrels, which are part of the South, are actually taking these depictions to the North to try to kind of engage sympathy.
So theater as propaganda?
Theater as propaganda. Listen, theater is propaganda. And in American theater, if you talk about American theatrical practice, right, all it is.
Right.
Yeah, wait till we get to the 1920s when the government is hijacking, shows and taking them away.
Yes. And before we started recording this podcast and we were talking about what we're going to be discussing, Tracey and I were talking about how painful it is to even teach this in our classes, how agonizing it is to realize that this was a part of the fabric of our culture. And yet it was. Not only was the Virginia minstrels performing, but that company was replicated an untold number of times, performing with the same stock characters, lots of the same music, to the same end that Tracey has described. So this was not just one group. It was an overwhelming number of groups performing these, so much so that they became codified, as Tracey alluded to, and we still see them showing up in media today, which is horrifying.
It was interesting. I was teaching this a year ago, and in a college classroom, and had the kids were doing private discussion, and they came back and they're like, wait a minute, is Donkey in Shrek a minstrel character? And I'm like, ding 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 ding.
Yeah.
It is based in that fabric. Now, while we understand that we're, what the community is trying to do, it's still something that we need to be aware of when we see it. And I think that's the most important part here, is that we need to wake up and understand what I'm seeing here is a historical stereotype.
Yes.
And we still may find it funny when we look at something like, a donkey. The Donkey in Shrek is a hard one for me when I watch it.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, oh no, don't laugh. Don't no. This is
But Eddie Murphy's really funny.
He's really funny, but it's like, I'm like, no, this is not.
Right.
So minstrelsy is a very, very, to call it problematic is light, right? In our history.
Question.
But it is so foundational to what happens next, because it does create kind of this vaudeville and musical revue style that moves forward, and it introduces blackface into musical theater culture, and that does not die until I think it's like the late 60s.
Yeah,
we don't really see this going away.
It's surprisingly late. Yeah, it's surprisingly late how long it hung on.
So from there, again, there's so much to say about it, and there's so much that we can do about it, and that's for another episode. But it's very important. But we're going to move on to get the rest of the timeline. The next rung on the timeline is something that we call variety shows that spring up in the 1860s, right after the Civil War. There's a guy named Tony Pastor who kind of cleans up these variety shows and kind of morphs them into vaudeville. But variety ends up being kind of based on a minstrel show type, but they are often very lewd. It's often pointed at kind of the young working class, and it's meant to, it's not meant for polite company. Tony Pastor comes in and says, wait a minute, I think we could do more with this. And he cleans it up and it morphs into something that we know now as vaudeville. Now, vaudeville.
Let me stop you right there if you don't mind. When we think about pre-Tony Pastor, the variety shows, think about where these were happening. You talked about expendable income. So we've got a lot of, particularly happening in New York, we've got a lot of people coming in as immigrants. They are working untold number of hours and they're beginning to generate some level of expendable income. So suddenly they can go out after work and hit up a tavern and have some funds, right? And so what happens is, what are we going to do with these people who are here? Well, let's entertain them. And so as you can imagine, you've got people coming off work after a long day and they want to let off some steam, and your imagination can probably fill in the blanks as to what a lot of that looked like. So that helps you to get a framework for what Tony Pastor was saying. Hey, wait a minute, let's make this more marketable to the masses so that families can come in and be a part of this. Sorry to interrupt, Tracey.
No, but it makes sense. If you look, it's so very American history. Like, it's like, okay, we're going to do something that's family entertainment. This is family entertainment. Oh, this is not. Okay, let's clean it up and bring it back. And, like, how do we, make this reborn into something new? So, the 1860s, we really get vaudeville, burlesque. Burlesque is exactly what you think it is. It's that variety show that's a little lewd, that's kind of has its own track record and does its own thing, but still is very much confined to the basements. Vaudeville is on the stage. Musical review is on the stage. But usually it's set up exactly like that minstrel show form, without always the narrating kind of characters, where you've got 12 or more separate acts where the first half to the intermission builds to the second biggest headliner they have, and then the second part builds to that biggest headliner so that everybody stays to the end. And these are individualized acts where you have performing monkeys and performing dogs, but you also have singers and you have comedians or you have tap dancers. So there's everybody's being included in this.
Well, and something else that I would add there is a reason why so much of it was visual entertainment instead of literary entertainment is because think about, again, the melting pot that New York was at this time. And we're thinking New York just because we're looking towards the development of Broadway. So that's why I'm speaking specifically about New York. But it was a melting pot. You've got people from Ireland and Italy and Germany and all of these different places who do not speak the same language. So they couldn't understand a narrative if you gave them one, but they can absolutely understand how funny it is to watch a dog in a tutu jumping through a hula hoop, right? That's funny. No matter the language, that's funny. And so that's why you see this rise of visual slapstick. I mean, the Three Stooges come right out of this because if you couldn't understand what they were saying, you could sure understand what Moe was doing when he hit Curly on the head with a mallet. Yeah, exactly. So we see slapstick, we see visual humor, sight gags, all of those things are at fever pitch. Certainly they had been used for the entirety of theater history, but they're at fever pitch at this moment in time. And a lot of that goes back to our audience. We had to give the audience something that they could understand. And because of our lack of a common language, that was not generally a literary show.
And just going right from that, the next avenue in American history is that we start to see this shift in the economy, whereas you start having, you're right, this large volume of immigrant families, immigrant workers that are coming in, and then you have this other level that is starting to rise, where the middle class is starting to make more and more money, and we start to see that income gap kind of start to happen, and that's when vaudeville and kind of musical reviews start to break off from the musical theater timeline. And one of the reasons why is when we get to about the 1880s, right before we get to that progressive movement, right before we get to, the progressive movement that builds wealth and all of that, and then we get to the robber barons in the 10s and 20s, we've got all of that kind of stuff happening. There's an audience that is splitting. You still have the immigrant population that still does not speak English, you're right, that still needs that kind of physical entertainment and still finds that entertaining. And then you've got another part that's interested in doing something that's American. All of a
Right.
sudden, you start seeing the rise of this after the Civil War, especially between the 1880s and 1820s, where it's like, well, 1810s probably, where it's like, we need to build things that are American. And we have a huge volume of that vaudeville audience break off and defect away, saying that is too common. Now, you're going to hear this throughout theater history, where you've got, the upper class and the lower class, the common people, right? And
High art, low art. Absolutely.
yeah, exactly.
These are still conversations that we're having today.
So so they're going to break off and start what we know as American operetta, which most of us have never heard of, but that's where they're going. Vaudeville continues. It doesn't go anywhere. They're going to come back and meet up with us in a little bit. But there is this huge split. And I think a lot of people forget that this split is why we then get narrative musical theater. So we move on from there. I'm going to put a pin in this for a minute. We're going to talk about something called the Black Crook. So again, this is what vaudeville kind of does. Vaudeville creates an avenue where like anything goes, right? I mean, it's like we can put as many things on there as possible. So there's this musical. People call it a musical. There's a lot of people who call it the first American musical, called The Black Crook. Literally, this is what happens. I believe it's a ballet troupe from France.
You're exactly right. It is.
Yeah, and totally like doesn't have enough money to get home, and it's like, what will we
Right.
do? And so
Let's find a big place and perform.
And in doing so, they join up with these other people that are doing music, and another group that'll do music, and then another group that will do kind of scenes from shows, and they put it all together on a Broadway stage. It's not on a vaudeville stage. It's more on a big, because they're a ballet troupe, they have access to kind of the bigger stages.
High art.
So they throw it up there, and this is in 1866. And they go on about their lives, they get their money, and they go home. A lot of historians have pegged this as the first musical because it's the first time you see like theater, dance, and music all happening at the same time on a stage. But it's vaudevillian almost. This is not a cohesive storyline. This is a disaster that has happened to this ballet troupe. Like they just want to get home. There was no
They are making
lemons
or lemonade out of lemons. That's what they were doing.
A lot of people are like, well, but they tried to make it a narrative art. And I'm like, you're right. They did try. But this just seems like a very weird thing to put to say, this is the first thing. We're going to put the Black Crook as the very first music. I'm like, I mean, we have much better narrative examples from ballad opera than this. And I'm not so sure why we've stuck our pin in this. Would I say that this is the first big American extravaganza? Yes. Not necessarily.
Except it had French ballet performers.
Well, you know what? You're
Performed
right.
by French,
Okay,
mostly French company.
I'm trying to throw a bone to people who truly will die on this
I know
hill.
you are, and God bless you for it. God bless you for it.
I'm not there. So
yeah. Well, and I would say, when I had my first ever history of musical theater history class, when I was a student in graduate school, this is, of course, is what I was taught by a very respected PhD in musical theater history, right? This is what he thought. This is what he taught anyway. And I'm sure it's what he thought. I mean, he wasn't going to tell me something that wasn't true, that he didn't, that knowingly tell me something wasn't true. But this is why I would say this is why we do research, right? This is why it is so important that historians are continuing to dig into the narrative and dig into the historic record and actually read about what these things were so that we can get a better understanding of it. What happened was he probably read it in a book that
Hmm.
said this is what it, and it may have been
And
written by Oscar Brockett, God love him,
it's still
that
in those
said,
books.
yeah, right, that said this is the first. And he didn't have the resources that we do now, where I can go on my computer and look at the New York Times from 1866 and be
Hmm.
like, wait a minute, this does not at all sound
Yeah.
like Oklahoma
You know what I
or
think
even
happened here?
Showboat, right?
Yeah, and I think what happened here is just that it's like somebody stumbled upon it and then
Yeah.
really looked at everything around it and said
And it was
nothing
an
else is going
anomaly.
on.
Yeah.
This has
Yeah.
got to be the first.
Yeah.
And
Right.
didn't keep going back. And as we've gone back and back and back, I'm like, but there, I
So
don't think we
much.
can say no to the minstrel show. I don't think we can say no to, all these other things. It's just not,
No.
it just doesn't quite work for me personally. So,
Right. No, I agree. It is an anomaly.
yeah, I think
That's
it
what it
is.
is. An anomaly.
And a good anomaly.
Yeah.
I mean, great. I think it's hilarious how this ingenuity came together. I just
And
don't
if I'm
think
not
you can call it the
mistaken,
first musical.
right. If I'm not mistaken, it was really popular. And there were, as there were with Gilbert and Sullivan shows, there were copycats that popped up all
Yes.
over. So
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't just like, oh, this one, they were like, this formula works. So you could certainly say, okay, maybe this is a notch in the slow roll towards what we now consider musical theater. But,
But they weren't
because
trying to make
creators
that.
saw, hey, well, maybe let's just no, that
Yeah.
that was not their intent.
No.
Exactly.
No. So you have a couple mid things happening here. We go from vaudeville. We're going to split off into a couple different areas here. We're going to split off, obviously, into burlesque, which I said before, vaudeville. There's also kind of a mid-level form called musical review, which is basically vaudeville with a theme. There's some sort
Right.
of theme
And this is
around
still
it.
very popular today.
Yes, very, very popular today. Then in the late 1880s, you start getting true American operetta, written by Americans, performed by Americans, put together in America, etc., and so on. There are four major writers of American operetta, and Kristin talked about Gilbert and Sullivan. These literally are patterning themselves
Yeah.
on Gilbert and Sullivan operettas. So that's something that we have to remember too, is that Gilbert and Sullivan operettas, if you go see them today, they still pack a punch. Like
Oh
they're
yeah.
not so old that you're like, I mean, they're old. I mean, think about how old. I mean,
1880s?
yes, this is
Yeah.
not. You don't usually get to go see something from the 1880s and go, gosh, that was great.
That was written really to lampoon English society and government,
And
right?
we still get
And
it.
it Pirates of Penzance, man, that show is
I
hilarious
love it.
and perfectly applicable
Uh huh.
to 2025 in the US of A. So,
And it is 100% a cash cow.
oh, no doubt.
Even in
No doubt.
1880s, like people are flocking to see this because they're wanting some more kind of meteor entertainment. Like,
Yeah.
that's what they're looking for. And so we have a generation of composers that grow up and start trying to create these American operettas. They don't all stay around very long. They kind of veer off into different places. Some of them into the more kind of music area, and not so much the musical theater area. But they really kind of get musical theater and its narrative structure working. And that is all dependent literally on Gilbert and Sullivan. It comes down to that. So there's four major composers. The two that you would have heard of are John Philip Sousa and Victor Herbert. Victor Herbert writes Naughty Marietta in 1910, and that's his biggest kind of American operetta. But John Philip Sousa, of all things, he's writing these American operettas in the 1890s because in the 1880s, he's such a good musician that these little American operetta companies are putting him on a boat, sending him to opening night for the first week of shows for Gilbert and Sullivan's new show out there, and he's going home and transcribing it
Oh my gosh.
and then finishing the score on the boat home so that they can open it. This starts a huge thing about copyright in our
Oh
country.
yeah.
And it's amazing to watch how like musical theater is in there. And it's because Gilbert and Sullivan are like, I'm sorry, we haven't even gotten here yet. How are you doing my show?
Well, and maybe you can clarify this for me because what I've always been taught is that there were like 100 pirated, pardon the pun, productions of Gilbert and Sullivan in the UK because there were no copyright laws. And in fact, this was a big impetus in the US for the development of copyright laws. Is that true?
Yes, this is like it's because Gilbert and Sullivan are like, look, well, the US had basically said to them, international copyright, like, we don't do that. And they're like,
We're our own thing.
and they basically fight for international copyright at that point. And John Philip Sousa is actually one of the people who pirated them the most. But they respected him very much. They actually like thought he did a fine job of it. If the apocryphal stories are true, but they worked together to get that copyright and international copyright and reciprocal copyright kind of things moving forward. It's the impetus for all of that. So all artists owe a debt of gratitude to them.
And am I right, and Tracey, correct me if I'm wrong, because you would definitely know better than me, but am I right that they opened some of their later shows in the US because they were better protected here? Is that true?
Yeah. Okay. So Gilbert and Sullivan come here, open it in the United States so that they have copyright protection in the United States, because if you open a show here, you can copyright it here, but not if it's, been done lots of other places.
Right.
So they would open the show here and then take it to London, and have it open a week later, several days later, to try to get the copyright there because the laws were different. It was so messed up.
Yeah.
Actually wrote quite a bit about this in a book called Working from the Wings that came out several years ago, but kind of documents this process of copyright protection, not only for the works themselves, but also for the recordings, because that was what was left out in this first wave of discussion. So John Philip Sousa, I mean, obviously we know him as Mr. America. We still listen to his works and everything, and he's looking at, what redefines the American zeitgeist, and I know far too much about him because I wrote my dissertation on him. And I'm going to stop right there and just say, because I could go down, I mean, we could talk about this for days. John Philip Sousa, Victor Herbert, these are people who are actually writing new American operas patterned after Gilbert and Sullivan, and that gives us kind of a template in how to write story with song. So that's what American operetta does. Is that good? I can leave it there, right? And keep moving.
Yeah, you just we'll talk about him another day, sweetheart. I know you're dying to tell us all you know. I get it. So we'll put a pin in him and come back.
So as we move into the 1900s, we start seeing, I call this, for students at the universities, I call this songs in the key of America. This is the time period.
I love it.
And this is the development of something we call American musical comedy, where we see a through line narrative there, with not as high art music as the operetta, but more vaudevillian kind of style, musical review style. But it's all
singable,
usually
hummable.
But it's all usually around a star vehicle. It's a star vehicle for whoever is kind of pitching it. And the biggest star at that point was a guy named George M. Cohan, who we call the father of the American musical. And he writes Little Johnny Jones in 1904. And Little Johnny Jones, I think, is very, very important because it does merge kind of the storylines and artistic craft of the operetta with vaudeville, and the entertainment value and the interactions with the audience. And I think that synergy is so, so important. So Little Johnny Jones, that's where he comes up with "I'm a Yankee Doodle Dandy" over and over and over again, and we sing it. All the children sing it in schools. We still sing that song. That is from a musical. But I mean, lots and lots of structured scripts that we get at this time kind of built on that model. But also because of where we are in the U.S., kind of history and the propaganda that's coming out of Washington trying to create a national identity
Yeah.
that we didn't really have at that point because the U.S. is
We were
so spread out.
And we were a baby nation.
Yeah. It's really funny how much you have to explain. I explain this to students all the time because I think we forget this. European countries have usually a very distinct sense of nationalism, and they are about the size of South Carolina.
Right.
You know, I'm like, it's so much easier to create this is who we are in a small space. But
yes.
I mean, if I was like, let's take Germany once it all comes together here and let's put it over here. How big is it? And they're like, oh, it's like Missouri. I'm like, yes.
Right. And the people are largely homogenous, right? They're generational Germans. They're not coming from all these different places like America had.
Yeah.
So not only does America have all of this geographical territory, but we also have a wide variety of people and nationalities and cultures represented here. And we're trying to get them all to literally sing the same song, you know?
And because, I mean, it's important because otherwise you don't have that kind of sense. Our government doesn't work based as it is. Right. Like, I mean, all of a sudden, I mean, in the 1900s, our government is well established and how it works and how the Senate works and how the House of Representatives works. And you have people who are living completely different lives with completely different. How do you get everybody on the same page about anything? And then you have the Spanish-American War, and then you have all of these things that are happening that we have to respond to as a nation, but we are all over the place. You know, it's not just what happens in the Civil War that is North versus South, which really like has far more of an impact on the East Coast than the West Coast. But as that West Coast starts to really kind of grow, we really start having to address the fact that we are a huge country and we have to have a sense of nationalism to kind of point everybody in the right direction. Yeah. So that's really important at this point because George Cohan does a really good job of creating kind of nationalistic identity or trying to, and just saying, hey, we're all Americans, we're all together in this. That's part of his shtick, right?
Right. It's a mystique, the American mystique of this Yankee Doodle Dandy, right?
Exactly.
That's the stock character that comes out of Cohan, is this red, white, and blue all-American boy or girl.
Exactly.
And it comes at a time when popular music, you know, we've got sheet music that's going crazy and everybody has a piano in their home. So they're playing the sheet music. And then not too far down the road, we get the development of radio. So suddenly we can reach the people on the other side of the country in a way that we didn't have the capacity to reach them with this propaganda prior to the coming of radio, really.
And so it's really interesting that you say that because that's the 1920s. And people don't seem to understand, like, the 1920s is when we get radio and we can broadcast semi-nationally, right?
Right.
Up until that point, the only thing that traveled, like, consistently around the country was vaudeville. It was the vaudeville circuit. And because George Cohan he grew up a vaudevillian with his parents. They were part of a group called the Four Cohans. And it was him and his sister and his parents. And they did all sorts of things. And they were very, very popular. And when he strikes out on his own, he takes these new kind of musical comedies that he writes, and he takes them on the vaudeville circuit. And so all of a sudden, everybody starts paying attention to the fact that, oh my goodness, this vaudeville circuit that we're putting these things on, that is the only thing that we can say a volume of the U.S. has seen. Not just we've only seen it on the West Coast or we've only seen it on the East Coast.
Right.
Everybody could have seen that. And they were so popular that a large volume, it becomes a great way to get that nationalistic propaganda out there. So much so that, we talked about John Philip Sousa. He's operating at this point too, and he's going out on that circuit as well with basically directives from the federal government to create support for different kind of national challenges that they're out. So that vaudeville circuit and those musical comedies become really, really important. There's a lot more detail, in there that we can share at another time. But it's such an important part of kind of American history because it's the only thing that's getting a message out to, you know, a good percentage of the country, that it can actually touch everybody, in a
Right.
way
And
that
just to drive that, but
newspapers
this is a
can't.
time, right. This is to drive that point home. There's no radio, as we've already mentioned. There's no film,
Mm-hmm.
right? We don't see the advent of film for another couple of decades when we're sitting at 1904, at least not on a widespread level. They're beginning to play around with it, particularly in Paris, but it's not widespread, certainly to the extent that it is now. So there wasn't the evening news.
Mm-mm.
So what did we have? We had the vaudeville circuit, and we
Mm-hmm.
begin to see, and other episodes we can talk about specific
Yeah.
um, uh, producers who were some leading kingpins
Yes.
in that vaudeville circuit, and those would include some names we still know today
Yeah.
as leaders in that vaudeville or leaders in the theater producing community. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I think that's a great point that this was the one thing that really could go from sea to shining sea.
Mm-hmm. Ooh, that's good. I need to write that down.
Thank you.
Oh my
Thank
gosh.
you.
I have never
Thank
used that
you.
before. That was really good. Okay, we're gonna have to write that down. It's gonna show up in a paper
Be
somewhere.
sure you cite me.
I
I want a
will.
citation.
Oh, I love it. Um, Other things that are happening at the same time as musical review, we see the rise of a man named Florenz Ziegfeld, who ends up in the 20s and 30s being a very, very big impresario, and we'll talk about him more, I'm sure, as we go along this podcast. But he is not an artist, but he is out to make money, and he's very, very good at what he does. The apocryphal story about him is that, he set up a tent in Central Park and was charging people to come see his dancing duck. And people were, oh my gosh, this is the apocryphal story. And people would come in and be like, oh my gosh, that duck is dancing. Like they'd play like a grinder music and the duck would be like, doing all this stuff. So all of a sudden, I mean, people are
Yeah.
flocking. He's making money hand over fist. And all of a sudden the police shut him down because it has come to light that he has put a grill, like an electrical current, in the cage of the duck. And as they play music, he turns it on. And so that duck is going, ouch, 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 ouch. And everybody's
Oh
like,
my
oh, look, it's
gosh.
dancing.
Oh my gosh. I had no idea.
He's
And then in 1907, wasn't it '07? He begins the regular annual follies that are
Yes, he
so
does. So
famous.
the Ziegfeld Follies obviously become like this really very standardized musical review. This is kind of taking everything that's come before it and making this an American form in and of itself. He makes the review commercially viable, and he does so by large spectacle and well-trained performers, and by, I mean, he's not a very nice guy. We could talk about him for a long time, but he also, one of the other things that he does is he kind of separates entertainment workers into groups. He's like, okay, you're going to be our showgirl, and this is what a showgirl looks like, and you're going to be a medium, a pony, a hoofer. Like these are the areas that you do, and this is how you can serve the musical, and I'm going to put this all together on the stage. So all of a sudden people who have specific skill sets are able to be in these shows for a small amount of time and a small amount of money, but still be able to say, hey, I'm in this show, and it still looks like they are the spectacle of it, and the 100 performers on stage still becomes just a sight to behold. So
Well,
he
and he's
really
able
does
to
that.
really blend that high and low art where he
Mm-hmm.
makes the review respectable, right?
Yes.
Suddenly people want to go see this because it's got the most beautiful costumes and the most beautiful settings and the most beautiful girls and the most
Mm-hmm.
beautiful voices. So he's able to kind of walk the line between those two worlds of low and high, and bring some respectability to the review, the form of the review, and it
Mm-hmm.
becomes dominant
Mm-hmm.
for a long, long, long time.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, I'm almost 20 years,
Yeah.
until, yeah. I mean, it just takes forever. Like, he just is going on and on and on. Um, he's not necessarily a nice guy. And there's a lot of the life of a performer, you know, life upon the wicked stage ain't nothing for a girl. And he's a good
Speaking of
reason why.
which, he produced that.
He did. He produced
He
Showboat.
produced Showboat.
Uh-huh. And he was sure it was going to fail. He was like, oh
Yeah.
my gosh.
I have
This is
risked
so
my
bad.
name and all my fortune on this show that's going to tank. And then what do you know? There's
It didn't.
people wrapped around the building in the next morning.
I
Yeah.
know. It's fun. Another thing that's happening here is we start establishing kind of a Broadway hub, a musical theater hub in New York City, and it's called Tin Pan Alley. Tin Pan Alley is roughly between 28th Street, between Broadway and 8th Avenue in Manhattan, and this was the area where all the song sheet music people were and the song pluggers. And so what would happen is you would go in if you were looking for a new song for your vaudeville show, and there'd be lots of different composers in different rooms with a piano, and they'd sing their best stuff for you and be like, okay, I want that one. I'm going to, I'm going to grade that, and then we can throw this into a show. So that's
And to put that, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
the major names that we're going to start hearing here very shortly: Jerome Kern, George Gershwin, Irving Berlin. These are all people who are playing in Tin Pan Alley during this time.
And if you're going to put that in a modern context, if there, if you want a visual of what that looked like to some extent, think about Beautiful, the Carole King musical, where you see 1650 Broadway and how those songwriters worked in little cubicles with a piano and them and their songwriting partner. And then next door to them was another little cubicle with a piano and a songwriting team. And they would just churn out song after song after song. That's built on the foundation of Tin Pan Alley and what was happening there.
Yeah. It's crazy. It's just crazy all the stuff that's happening in the in the aughts and the 1910s that most of us don't ever even hear about, that are so influential to what's going on. I want to put a pin in this, and we can talk about this in a different episode, but I want to make sure that I mention that this is also the time that Shuffle Along comes out. Written by U.B. Blake and Noble Sissel. These are the ones that I said in the very first episode that I was like, Rodgers and Hammerstein are considered that those fathers of the American musical, but this is a fully integrated musical in a way that we have not seen. You can set Shuffle Along next to Oklahoma and be like, oh, look, they're doing very, very, very different things with this with their playwriting, with their craft. And it's really good. So again, the idea of the fathers of American musical, it maybe should go to Blake and Sissel. I'll go that far.
Well, and let's just state, I mean, these were two Black creators and an entirely Black cast, in case you're wondering why we don't stick the flag there.
Yeah.
Why historians have not traditionally done that. The case could certainly be made that it's because they were Black creators and had a Black cast.
Yeah.
And we didn't want to make that them the fathers of American musical theater, which is a sad thing to say, but knowing how things have gone throughout theater history, probably not off base.
So it runs for over 500 performances on Broadway.
Which was unbelievable then.
Unheard of at that time.
Unbelievable.
Absolutely unbelievable. It actually breaks the orchestra color line long before we were talking about doing anything like that. African Americans were actually permitted to sit in the back third of the orchestra, which I know is not, but they're not just up in the balcony.
Not in the balcony, right.
Anymore. The song that comes out of this one that we may have known as Wild About Harry. Harry Truman uses this as his campaign song. I'm just wild about Harry. Yeah, Harry's wild about me. Yeah, he goes on and on. It's lots and lots of fun. But this show is really very, very good, and it does not, it just gets ignored because of who wrote it.
Right.
So I always want to kind of stick
well, and it wasn't that it just ran for 500 plus performances on Broadway. It toured.
Oh,
and
yes.
was enormously successful on the road. I mean, it was just a juggernaut. And we can talk at another time about the economics of Broadway, but just in a nutshell, there used to be, now we maybe have 15 openings a season. I mean, it's nothing compared to 220 that we would have in the 20s because
Hmm.
shows cost $60,000 to produce back then.
Yeah.
So they were much cheaper to produce, so you didn't have to run for 15 years to recoup your investment. So that's why we say 500 performances, which would now be like, bless its heart. But back then, that was a major run
Yeah.
because of the economics of Broadway being so different back then. But we'll
Yeah. I
talk
mean, it
about that
feels like
later.
a Mary Poppins run or something like that.
Yeah, right.
Like very, yeah, maybe not a Wicked run, but still
Healthy,
just
very healthy.
insane how that
Yeah.
moves.
Yep.
The other thing that I want to mention, the next kind of rung on our timeline, is in the 1910s, something called the Princess Musicals. We still have all of this review happening on Broadway. There's this little tiny theater called the Princess Theater, and it is an intimate venue. All the other theaters are huge and can accommodate 500 people. This one can only, it's like a 99 seat theater. It's like 100 seats maybe. And nobody ever wants to work in there because they can't make it showy enough. And so they're like, what are we going to do here? And so they start hiring composers from Tin Pan Alley to come in and create shows for their stage. Not just create their shows that they want for their stage that will help. That will make money. And one of the people that they hire is Jerome Kern. Jerome Kern, who ends up writing Showboat with Oscar Hammerstein, learns very, very quickly that the only way, if they can't do any spectacle in a show, to keep people there is to have that engaging story. So these princess musicals, which we don't do anymore, are so important because they provide kind of the resting ground for Jerome Kern to learn, how do we just tell a story and just make it about what is happening dramatically on stage, not about, like, the horses that can come on stage or whatever it is. And they end up creating these coherent little musicals and learning how to integrate music into the drama. So they start with drama and they start learning how to integrate that music into it. That helps then move the story forward. Some of the things that people say is that they wanted it to be coherent. They want the numbers to carry the action of the play. He wants the characters and the situations to be realistic, American, contemporary. Those are things that they're trying to do in this moment. And it sounds a whole lot like what he and Oscar Hammerstein are trying to do on a much bigger stage. So we often ignore the princess musicals. I think we really start getting the groundwork for integrated musicals, which, we go to Oklahoma, and that's what we first integrated musical.
Yeah, that's right.
Like we're starting the process here with the princess musicals, which is kind of great. Okay, the 1920s. So how do we move from the 1910s to the 1920s? The 1920s are very much like how do you say this? They're a time of kind of not necessarily the status quo, but making sure that we're building the foundation so we can grow later.
Right.
This is the time of the Jazz Age, the rise of lots and lots of composers like Cole Porter, Rodgers and Hart get their start here. The Gershwin brothers. We start seeing ASCAP gets underway because we start seeing a lot of song recycling happening, and they're not happy about it. And we have to kind of revamp what we're doing because we can't do the same things over and over and over again. We have to produce a lot of new material because vaudeville houses are now competing with movies.
Right.
So we're having to do even more spectacular things live than they can do in film. So we're seeing a lot of money being dumped into, especially the kind of visual art side of theater during this time, and it's super important. But the big musical here in 1927 is Showboat.
Right.
So Showboat, we get Jerome Kern and Oscar Hammerstein. Very young Oscar Hammerstein was trying to do something very big and very not necessarily not ostentatious, but he really wants to write something important in writing Showboat, and create, and Jerome Kern wants to create kind of a coherent musical that can survive on a bigger stage. Like, how do we do that? And then who comes in? Well, we've got Ziegfeld, who comes in and produces it. So it ends up being this kind of smash of like coherent, integrated musical form, spectacle, and then Oscar Hammerstein, who has a heart for social commentary, basically. And you see all those things just kind of start smashing together with Showboat. And it's like,
well, and what you've got happening outside of musical theater is the kind of bubbling to the surface of things like the group theater, which are going to be working and really focusing on psychological realism in theater. And we see Eugene O'Neill writing and things like this. So theater, the American tradition, is beginning to take root.
Yeah.
And as in the late 20s, early 30s, and through the 30s, we see this, particularly in legitimate theater. And I say legitimate meaning plays versus musicals. That's where you see that Oscar Hammerstein was really at the fore, and Jerome Kern was really at the fore of that, wanting to apply those same sensibilities to musical theater. And that's what he was attempting to do by adapting Edna Ferber's novel, Showboat.
Well, I mean, it's really great that you bring that up, because Kern, when he's trying to do the princess musicals, is looking at that American theater tradition that's just starting, the little theater movement. And then you get the group theater, and then you get like that are trying to create an American style, and looking to those folks and going, how are they doing it? And then how do I just bring music to it? So it's one of the few places where they kind of sync up a little bit.
Yeah. And we've got actors who have been trained by the great Russian director Konstantin Stanislavski. They've been trained in acting, and they come over to the U.S. and they're wanting to apply that to, to actors and directors in the U.S. So that we need a literature that can facilitate opportunities for these freshly trained performers to show what they've learned. But that doesn't exist here. So it's got to be written and developed. And that's what's happening, beginning to happen at this stage of the game. And more and more money is going into it as well. So it's really starting to create this groundwork. And by the end of the 20s, we do have, we have the start of kind of the American bibliography of theater, like the big names in theater. And then, we've got crafts kind of coming up around them to support them. So we actually have kind of the theater business really does get solidified. Oscar Hammerstein is credited as an assistant director, but he's really the stage manager for years for his grandfather and his uncle. And he really learns that track, and then learns how it's different than the director. So we're solidifying what all these roles do, and it's all just kind of coalescing and coming to head, so that we actually have a business model here at the end of the 20s that kind of comes to a head with Showboat, which is wonderful and beautiful. But then in 1929, what happens? Well, there's a little economic crisis.
There's a hiccup there.
A little economic crisis that we call the Great Depression, which begins with Black Tuesday, October 29th. Is it 29th? October something.
I think so.
1929. And everything changes. Suddenly people don't have the money to go to the theater or to produce the theater, or if they do, they don't want to see shows that make you think and feel negative emotions, right?
Yes.
They want to escape.
Yes, most definitely. And we put a whole bunch of people out of work.
Right.
Right?
Right. No doubt.
One of the best ways I found to kind of hit this home is Lawrence Ziegfeld has gone to court on Black Tuesday because he doesn't want to pay somebody for some work he did for a show that he didn't like. He thought it was he thought it was low quality or whatever. So he didn't want to pay, so the guy took him to court. So he's in court literally being like, not going to pay this, whatever. He walks out of court and he has lost all of his money in the crash.
Oh my gosh.
So he goes in there like, the richest man on Broadway, basically, with all of this power behind him, and walks out penniless.
Unbelievable.
And he had no idea it was happening. So you have to kind of look at that. Were there other things that he produced? Yes, but he had no money to put them up. The business goes bust, he goes bust, everybody around him goes bust. And so the 30s are a really interesting time in musical theater because most people are, most of the really interesting work is happening in the Federal Theater Project, which really gets our regional theater set up happening in the U.S. And it's so important for kind of the theater business to spread it out and make sure that everybody has it. It's not just concentrated on Broadway, because all of a sudden Broadway has tons of people and no jobs whatsoever.
Right.
But what's happening musically in the 30s, some really important things, but not things that are necessarily
memorable.
Well, and long-term, ideas. The other thing about them
groundbreaking.
Is they're not groundbreaking, but they're all done by people who have money already or have, are being bankrolled by family money or whatever it is. I mean, if you think about Cole Porter, if you think about Porgy and Bess, if you think about all of Cole Porter's stuff that comes out during there, and he's an amazing lyricist. He really is very, very good. And they don't necessarily get the recognition because not a lot of people are seeing them.
Yeah. So for instance, Anything Goes comes from the 30s.
Yes.
So if you're familiar with that show, that would be typical of a musical comedy, as it would have been called, that would have been produced in the 1930s. Cole Porter obviously wrote that. But something that's interesting that's happening with the songwriters is that so many of them, because the work had dried up on Broadway, had gone to write movies for film.
Los Angeles.
That's right, because they could make $2,000 a week to sit in a studio and write a song on demand. And that's way better than working for 9 months to produce a show on Broadway that you're not going to make nearly that much money. And you're going to put in 57 times the work to do it. So much of the songwriting talent was in. Yeah, no question. And you're right, Cole Porter is definitely one of them. Yeah.
It's just an interesting kind of caveat because it is like Anything Goes is great, but it is. I really like it.
It didn't change anything. It didn't. Right. Absolutely.
It's not. I mean,
it was status quo.
We see people honing their skills, but we don't necessarily see them all honing them skills on Broadway. I mean, if you look at Oscar Hammerstein at this time, he goes off to Los Angeles and he becomes a script doctor.
Yeah, and he's really floundering. Like
he's not writing any musical theater. He's just writing.
Right.
He's like fixing scripts and making, the climax happen at the right point. And we need people like that. But that's how he's honing his skill during this time. But it's a waiting game until World War II. When the United States gets pulled into World War II and the economy and the New Deal and all of that kind of stuff starts revving up again, and we can actually start, the numbers are starting to look better about actually doing a musical on Broadway, and that's when Oklahoma happens. So that's how we get to Oklahoma. There's a lot in there, a lot more than people think.
There is a lot. Yeah, there is a lot. And you've done a great job of making it as concise as possible to make that wide a span of theater history. So well done. I learned a lot personally. But there is a lot there. And it's important, as we said at the outset, that people understand these things do not happen in a vacuum, that theater is, as William Inge says, a reflection of life. And so theater is reacting to, reflecting what is happening in the larger culture, and being used to maybe shape some attitudes towards that culture, as we will have also seen in the government's use of the theater for propaganda. So I think you've done a great job of covering it and making it very easy to understand. So thank you. Well done.
You're welcome. The next one is from Oklahoma to the present, and that's only like 100 years, not 300. So we're good.
It'll be like 15 minutes. Give us 15 minutes and we'll get that one
right. I've met you. You've met me.
Right. I was about to say, this is where I kind of have some things to say. So it definitely will not be 15 minutes.
Awesome.
All right, that'll do it for this episode of the Dr. Broadway podcast. Tune in next time when we'll be talking about the American musical Oklahoma and beyond. Until then, connect with us via email, as Tracey said, at hello@drbroadway.com or on Instagram or TikTok at Dr. Bway Podcast.